Do you think there's progress in the social sciences? Does the academic enterprise produce more light than heat or more heat than light?
I guess I'm kind of pessimistic about that. I'm not that happy. I mean, I don't think there's any way for people to approach this question, particularly as it concerns the most important things, which are ideological in nature. We're talking about public policy, the way rules in society should be. And I personally don't think it's useful to try to approach the broad question you just asked as though you can somehow separate your own sensibilities about those matters in the way you approach the larger question, the meta question, if you like, that you asked. And that's why I think it's important, to say up front that, I'm one of these people who think that we have too much government intervention. I think the culture is too socially democratic. I think that's a big part of what's going on with these social sciences. I believe that there's a sort of groupthink problem writ large, both in a narrower sense. If you look at the pyramids of individual academic disciplines, history, psychology, sociology, there's a sort of groupthink dynamics going on in each of those. I also would even say, though, that there's a broader society-wide groupthink, which in a sense descended on us with the decline of liberalism, classical liberalism. So my whole take is interwoven with those other sensibilities on this. So my answer is yes, and it's because I see all of these policies and all of these opinions around me that I do think are misguided.
Let me unravel some of that or untangle it, because there's a bunch of different threads in there. And particularly, I want to talk about revealing one's own ideology, and then I want to talk about the groupthink. I've always, I think I mentioned this in a couple other podcasts, but I've always resented it deeply when I'd be labeled as a, quote, conservative economist. One, I'm not particularly conservative, but just the whole idea that I have ideological labels disturbing to me. And because I used to think, and I've had second thoughts about this, as listeners know, but I used to think, look, I have my ideology. Sure, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not. I don't hide it. But that's distinct from my role as an economist, because as an economist, I'm just a scientist. I'm just seeking out truth. I'm weighing evidence. And yes, it's true that most of the surveys and data that I find convincing seem to confirm my opinion, but that's because those are the good ones. And as listeners will know, I've become sort of more realistic, I think, about my own biases over the years. And I think but I think most economists would disagree with me. I think most economists would say, yes, they hold my original view. Yes, you have your hat as social scientist, and you have your hat as neighborhood across the fence debater on what's the best policy of the day. But I keep those separate. And journalists, for example, I was just talking to some journalists. They say that they like the idea of the same thing. Of course, I vote a particular way every time. Yes, I have a bias internally, but I don't let that affect my reporting, because I'm objective. I'm a journalist. I'm a professional, and a professional knows how not to cheer in the press box. So, except for sports, where there is some cheering in the press box, most people in the media like to think that they're independent, objective seekers of truth. So what you're suggesting, and I've come to agree with part of it, is that that's naive. It's an illusion, and it goes against what we understand about human nature, which is that we are affected by these emotional and core values, and we shouldn't expect it to be otherwise. Then it only becomes a question of what label I should use. And you, for example, in an article at the Library of Economics and Liberty, have pushed, I think, an interesting label, the Smith-Hayek label, for my identity. So it wouldn't sell too well when I'm on National Public Radio, not because of its flavor, but because people have no idea what it is. But if someone said, well, let's hear from Russell Roberts, who's a Smith-Hayek economist, that would be troublesome, because most people wouldn't – that doesn't convey anything. But you're suggesting, though, that would be a better world, that we admit and reveal where we're coming from.
Yes, particularly for these broader questions like the one you asked me, which is really a philosophy of science or sociology of science question. Gunnar Myrdal, Nobel Prize winning social democratic economist, not a classical liberal, wrote a book, Objectivity in Social Science, arguing that not only is it legitimate to disclose your ideological sensibilities, but that it's very useful. It alerts the reader to ways that you might be biased. It alerts. It's like a kind of disclosure, like a vested interest kind of disclosure, because after all, ideological sensibilities are commitments that we carry around with us, and are likely to bias. Not just inferences we might make, but formulations of the very problem and selection of the topics, the positions, the arguments that we consider. So he wrote a whole book arguing in favor of ideological disclosure or self-disclosure. Other economists like Frank Graham and recently Peter Lewin have also endorsed this kind of self-disclosure.
But I think if you went around the profession today at the top level, not throughout, but at the top level, meaning if you went to the people that we would consider, that the profession would consider the top 1,000 economists, which would be a huge portion of the people who do influential research, that would overwhelmingly include those folks. And you say, what kind of economist are you? They would say, well, I went to X, where X would be their university. I got a PhD from X. In fact, I just heard someone make this claim, where X is a consensus top 5 PhD program. And he said, well, of course, anyone who goes to X is a well-trained economist and therefore understands what works and what doesn't work. And that's end of story. It's like saying you want a bridge built by an engineer, you get a good engineer, and that's the end of the story. So if you want to fix the economy today in its current situation, you just need somebody well-trained at a good first-rate university. So they wouldn't label themselves, a lot of folks. I think they'd say, I have no ideological bias. I'm just a truth seeker. Do you think I'm right? And what would you do about it if I am?
I think you're generally right. And I think that claim is partly disingenuous when you hear it, and partly not just naive.
Self-deception is what part of what you're saying.
Yes, I agree. It's somewhat disingenuous because I think a lot of these guys know that there's certain people they'll hang around with at a cocktail party and others they won't. And it's not necessarily because of who's an economist. It's because of things like ideology and who their sentiments really coordinate with, who really sees the world the same way that they do. It's partly naive because, they see what they've been trained in, the normal science, right? The practices of normal science, the core courses in publishing and the journals. And they don't, I don't think that hard about the norms in normal science and the way those norms have evolved to, exclude certain kinds of arguments, exclude certain kinds of discourse, keep the discussion on what I call between the 40-yard lines, kind of an establishment focus, where anything outside of that, talking about more radical reforms, is somehow being an advocate or being normative or what have you. So I do think there's a lot, and there's ways also just in which I think economic theory is done that eclipse a lot of important ideas, like Hayekian ideas about discovery and the richness of knowledge. So I just think they're naive to a good extent about how normative, as it were, they are in doing what they call positive economics.
Well, let me turn to the groupthink issue, because I think that there's a useful way to come out of this discussion into that one. I sometimes, now that I'm more open and honest about this labeling issue, call myself a free market economist, which is a version of the Smith-Hayek identity that is just better understood, in that most people have some idea of what free market means. They may not know what a Smith-Hayek formulation is in your use of it. So one problem with this revelation strategy, this honesty strategy, is that it is then prone to sort of an ad hominem attack. Oh, you're you're a free market economist, or you're like Milton Friedman, but he's been discredited, hasn't he, by the recent crisis? Or free markets have been discredited by the recent crisis, and so I find having to cope with that. I put a lot on my shoulders if I take that approach, and it strikes me that the groupthink problem, which I'd like you to elaborate on, is not unrelated to that problem, that a certain cultural cocktail party, who's the right circles phenomenon comes into play when you label yourself, and there's a tendency to want to get be on the good side, have the good label. And so I wonder if those two things are consistent. That is, given the existence of what I think of as groupthink, does that mitigate against the virtue of being honest about your ideology?
Right. Good points. I think there are drawbacks to self-disclosing, and I don't think it's something that you need to overdo. It can rub people the wrong way, and it just can be kind of unnecessary and gratuitous, to be sure. It can also be self-important. A couple of things. One thing is that, starting off by declaring you're a free market economist just could draw you into larger issues, all of a sudden kind of changing the topic. Oh, we thought we were going to talk about the current crisis, and now suddenly you're saying all of free market economics is discredited, and we could talk about that, which is so much larger, and it just can be distracting. Also, there are issues of groupthink, even sort of within our group. Certainly, groupthink, I think, is a pejorative term. It's pejorative by construction, kind of like rent seeking is. It's groupthink is. Too much of a readiness among the group to believe what we consider to be defective ideas. The defectiveness of the ideas is essentially being presupposed by the term and by the analysis. Now, even within, free market libertarian circles, our circles or what have you, we can
don't label me, Dan.
Yeah.
I don't fall easily into a box.
Okay. Anyway.
Just humor. Sorry.
Even within, groups which have policy judgments like mine, there can be groupthink, certainly. And it's not so much that the policy judgment is defective, but perhaps the argumentation for it is defective. So you can have groupthink in the argumentation for a sound policy. And that's a kind of groupthink. Think tanks that are kind of hackish or what have you, but maybe you kind of agree with the punchline, the policy punchline, can still very much be immersed in groupthink. So there's groupthink, the groupthink analysis can sort of be directed at the policy judgment and then also at the argumentation for the policy judgment and so on. So, and yeah, groupthink plagues all of our groups.
Now, you said it's a deliberately pejorative term. Let me defend groupthink for a minute, and then I want to let you counter it. One of the virtues of groupthink is that it creates it embeds a sort of conservatism, small c conservatism, in the evolution of what is thought to be right. And you could argue that that's a good thing, right? It's better that we aren't all over the place.
That's right.
That we move in small steps, that it should take a big set of new ideas and new evidence before we revise and radically change what we believe. And so give me your counter to that, and then talk about what you think there is in the academic enterprise, in the university structure, that encourages the wrong kind of groupthink.
Okay. First of all, on the hazards of not having enough groupthink, that's a big Kuhnian theme.
About Thomas Kuhn.
As in Thomas Kuhn. And I'm thinking not so much of the structure of scientific revolutions, but rather his other work with Deirdre McCloskey so often rightly plays up, The Essential Tension, a selection of essays. He talks about the essential tension between tradition, between keeping to established focal points in science, and innovation. right? And scientific creativity, like you say, if you allow too much to the latter, it kind of gets all over the place, and nothing clearly is focal. The enterprise is no longer coherent, and so there's this essential tension between sort of convention and innovation in science, which I think is quite profound. Now, yeah, I definitely think that we can be too much towards convention, too much towards tradition, too much towards affirming certain things of the group, and in particular, faith in the leaders of the group, faith in the apex of the pyramid, if you will. And well, gee, what makes me believe that we should think this or worry about this is simply that we have economic science supposed to be talking about the most important economic issues, coming to judgments on those. And as I see it, on a lot of important issues, the right answers, as it were, simply are not being arrived at, well formulated, expressed, and conveyed through the ecology of the culture, okay, through like an FDA is a favorite topic of mine. And I think that first of all, the whole apparatus of the whole banned until permitted structure, which really emanates from Congress and the FDA administers, that whole structure is terribly and tragically misguided. And this isn't some private opinion. In fact, so many economists, Milton Friedman, Sam Peltzman, Gary Becker, and many of the scholars who work specifically on the topic reach maybe not the radical conclusion, but certainly express a liberalization conclusion. And when you count noses of all the people who actually express, it's very, very one-sided.
Which side?
Towards liberalization. Of the economists who actually express a policy judgment on the FDA.
You're talking about the Food and Drug Administration. Go ahead.
Right. And specifically, I'm thinking of the control and specifically the permitting of new drugs. They almost all favor liberalization. I could get into more specifics if you wanted to, but so this is a very major conclusion on a super important topic. In some sense, as I see it, these economists who express judgments on the issue, okay, reach a conclusion, and yet, if you poll economists at random, they don't have that view of the FDA. In fact, they're rather supportive of the current. So there's a very significant impasse between the issue expressive economists, if you will.
The so-called, you might call them specialists, but they're not just specialists.
That's right.
They include people who are just passionate about the topic.
Yeah, and I don't think we want to discount the Milton Friedman when he has a chapter in Free to Choose. I mean, you don't call him an expert on the FDA, but he's expressing a judgment and making himself accountable to the public for it and his reasons for it. So those issue expressive economists, it's not a very pretty term, but I just don't have a better one. The issue expressive economists often reach a conclusion, particularly in favor of liberalization, much more so than random economists reach a conclusion. And
no, wait a minute. That's not what you.
Yeah.
They reach a conclusion that's different from the mainstream.
That's right.
Than the average economist.
That's right.
It's not just that they're more likely to have a feeling. Right. They have a different feeling.
Yeah. Yes. Although sometimes the average economists are just all over the place, and it's sort of centered in the middle, and they don't really have a clear consensus at all. But the point is this: there's a number of very important issues I just feel very confident in, that are important. It's like a shame. It's almost, like an injustice that the knowledge, the enlightenment is not being held up and getting out.
Okay,
and so we need to look at what is going wrong, right, in the culture. Can I take the academic groupthink thing and more in terms of ideology?
Yeah, sure.
I think what you say about methods and being quantitative relates to those, but I'd rather just focus on the ideology first. We are very much of a minority in that sense too. us free market people. And it's not just we are in economics a minority. The Smith-Hayek contingent is perhaps 10% of the people out there. But then when you go to the other social sciences, it's basically non-existent. I mean, there's practically no free market people, classical liberal people in sociology, history, psychology, and the humanities, philosophy. And to the extent that they are dealing with policy issues and politics, and to the extent that they tend towards a contrary view, which I think it's fair to say they do, I would call it a social democratic view, there's a big problem there. Okay, there's the defectiveness that I talked about as a kind of...
Can you explain that again?
Well, defectiveness is sort of the starting point for suspecting groupthink, because groupthink, presupposes defectiveness. And you and me talking about this are going to come to sociology and history and so on with a feeling that there's a large defectiveness there. FDR, saved America from laissez-faire and the Great Depression and stuff like that, for example, in history. Not that they all think that or that that's so much an established thing, but it's a quite common view. It certainly is in the public schools and all that, another great realm of groupthink and so on. So why is it? How is it? Or how could it be? Maybe stepping back now from the ideology, but how can it be that defective ideas can persist? Okay, let's not ask how they first get established. Okay, let's assume somehow they can get a focal, tipping point and get established. How can they persist? I would point to two mechanisms in particular. One's more micro and one's more macro within each discipline. The more micro is what goes on within a department at each university. Departments are very autonomous. They're not taking marching orders from deans and provosts. They very much make their own personnel decisions, which then more or less get rubber stamped. And the way it works within the department, by and large, is majoritarian politics. Now, if a majority has a certain point of view, and if they also believe that sharing that point of view is actually part of the scholarly judgment, okay, which is a very fair belief, as we've been saying, they will, if they're 55% and they're hiring, they'll become 60%, and then they're 60% and they're hiring, and they become 65%, and I think there's a tendency then at the departmental level for it to go towards uniformity. And heck, Russ, here we are sitting in GMU econ department, and it's pretty uniform.
It is. It's the only place that's uniform in the direction that it's uniform, that is towards the Smith-Hayek,
at least
classical liberal place.
At its level of status, yeah.
Yeah, and its size. I mean, it's not four people who've picked a fifth who agrees with them. It's 20-plus people who all take a similar view toward the correct role. And there's a lot of diversity here, obviously, but
not all. It's not all. I'm sure we have people voting Democratic in this department.
Well, excuse me. I'm sure we have people who vote.
That's right.
There are a lot of people who don't vote because they find the whole enterprise.
That's right. I've never voted Republican.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear. It's not like we're a Republican department. I'm sure there are people who do vote Republican, but it's
there's a preponderance, a mass preponderance
of
free market,
classically liberal folks here.
And furthermore, while we're at it, I for one do think that the scientific judgment ought to reflect that. I mean, if someone's not getting some of those issues, what I consider right, I doubt them as an economist. Frankly,
you're in a small group, Dan. Again, right?
In this department, do you mean?
No, I mean in the world.
In the world, yeah, absolutely. But I'm just saying that I conform to my theory of what happens in departments that way, and so there's this tendency towards uniformity within the department. Okay, now where does the department look to for its norms and standards of quality, fairness, excellence, focal points for all that, and it looks to the established structures of its discipline. Okay, and so then there's the wider discipline, which has a pyramidal structure in the rankings of departments. Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, and what have you. are going to be looked up to and followed very much in this way, as well as journals, publishers, and things of that nature. And so you have a pyramid that really leads all of these departments. The history department at a university, the history department, for that matter, at George Mason University, in an existential sense, is not so much a creature of George Mason University. It is a creature of history. Okay, the historians at George Mason University, whom I hardly know any of, by the way, their identity is much more wrapped up in being a historian than being a George Mason employee.
Sure.
And so, if you have we have this pyramidal structure, and if the pyramidal structure goes a certain way ideologically, it's going to sweep people of that ideology into positions throughout the entire pyramid. Another important part of that is the creation, the making and placing of new PhDs. I mean, it's the large departments at the apex of the pyramid who make the most PhDs and who place them the best, and who then go on maybe a little bit an echelon down to be professors and make PhDs. So we have the micro level majoritarian politics within departments tending towards uniformity. And then we have this pyramidal structure throughout the discipline that can lead to uniformity throughout the entire pyramid, so that practically every professor and every history appointment throughout the country comes to be most likely of the ideological ilk that has come to be very much dominant.
That's a rather strange viewpoint although comforting, it's a rather strange viewpoint for a market-oriented person to have. Here we have an industry that is somewhat regulated, but not particularly. There's no, as you say, we're autonomous even within our own university. And I would argue that one of the things that George Mason has done wisely as an economics department is to not try to be a top department like the others. We've decided not to go in the mainstream direction. It's an interesting phenomenon because, rankings matter. Being in the top 5 matters, the top 10, the top 20. Only 20 schools can be in the top 20. It's a strange thing. Ruling out ties at the 20th position. And yet most schools from 20 to 50 are vying for excellence. And the way they try to get into the top 20 is to be better at the things that the top 20 schools are already doing very well. So it's a very, in some sense, it's a fool's game. But that's the game that a lot of departments pursue. A department I will not name. I once heard about departmental meetings there where they would not hire so and so because so and so couldn't get a job at MIT. This school is not MIT. It's not in the top 20. It's maybe in the top 40. But since this person would not get a job at MIT, they wouldn't lower themselves and hire this person, even though it might have made their department better. So at George Mason, we've eschewed that strategy. We said we're not going to try to do what everybody else does and do it as well. We're going to do something different from what everybody else does, and we're going to do that as well as we can. And essentially, there's a market opportunity. What some of our colleagues call, the Moneyball strategy of looking for a niche where we can do very well because it's not rewarded by the mainstream pyramid you're talking about. So why doesn't that happen? Why there's this huge? You're suggesting there's a huge market opportunity that people ignore to be part of this apparatus. Why don't they be different, stand out, and excel at something a little bit less mainstream?
That is the big question. Let me just gather my thoughts for a second on that. First of all, we're talking about culture. We're not talking about haircuts and toothpaste and so on. And culture itself is very much of a network externalities kind of thing. Furthermore, we're talking about political culture. And so the power of politics, I do think, plays a role in society in general, in terms of creating incentives, creating prestige, creating eminence, creating status. There's also the question of the structure of the institutions that are functioning here, the apparatuses, if you will. And you say it's a free market, but on the other hand, something like 75%, or maybe I think it's more like 70% of college teachers in America are government employees. So it's not exactly a private enterprise economy.
Research money is mostly coming from the government.
Yeah. And so I think there's a whole lot that goes wrong in analogizing the market for historians, the market for economists, with, let's say, the waiter market, waiters at restaurants. I mean, if we imagined a world where waiters had a kind of a job market like economists, right? They would come from a waiter department, right? And waiters would be minted as new PhDs by other waiters, and then, as it were, sold to other waiters. And the demanders of these new waiters are spending money which they're not all that accountable for, and which come from a whole diffuse range of sources, some of which are extracted coercively. So I mean, there's a lot of breakdown in the parallel between sort of the private enterprise labor market for waiters and this cultural market. Of course, there's some parallels, but cultures go wrong. I mean, and then there's all sorts of lock-ins that happen institutionally and, importantly, individually. I mean, we have to keep in mind that when it comes to basic beliefs, particularly about religion and about politics, people rarely change their mind after the age of 25 or 30. This is quite well established. And so it's kind of a taboo, this point. We're not actually supposed to bring it out because we like to kind of carry on our discourse as though we're more open and there's more hope for changing the minds, particularly of our leaders, of the influentials, than there really is. But you know, who are the cultural leaders? It's not going to be the neophytes. It's going to be the people who are locked into their beliefs, and so you can easily have generation after generation locked into bad cultural commitments.
Let me bring up a story that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is outside of these ideological issues, which I agree. I mean, it's fascinating. It's a separate, we could spend years on it, this whole interface between your philosophy or ideology and then your academic work in history or economics. And we've touched on it a little bit, but I want to bring up a different example, which is the example of Semmelweis. Semmelweis was a doctor who was upset and alarmed and troubled by the fact that so many women were dying in childbirth of puerperal fever, which was a disease that in the last half of the 19th century was a major cause of death of post-delivery women. And Semmelweis had a theory, which of course was true. His theory was that doctors eager to discover the cause of puerperal fever would go to the morgue and examine women who had died in this very painful and horrific way. And then they would go deliver a baby, passing on the fever, the disease via infection to the mother. And that what Semmelweis said would reduce death rates dramatically, and again, he was correct, would be to wash your hands or stay away from the morgue if you were an obstetrician. And the profession did not agree with this. The profession felt that the cause of puerperal fever was vapors or some kind of airborne thing, and their strategy for reducing puerperal fever was to close the windows in the delivery section of the hospital. And there's a wonderful book on this. I've forgotten the author and the name, but I'll put it up on the website for this podcast. And in this book, it describes the fact that Semmelweis, of course, he was sure he was right. The doctors who were much older and much wiser in their minds than Semmelweis thought they were right about the windows. So Semmelweis designed an experiment to prove his theory. And I think, at least according to this biography of Semmelweis, he wasn't the most pleasant fellow. So you have which is often the case with renegade thinkers. Often to sustain their viewpoint, they're arrogant and difficult to get along with, maybe other reasons. So Semmelweis wasn't very pleasant. He designed an experiment that he did in sort of a half-hearted way because he knew it was right. And then the experiment showed some inclination that his theory was correct, but because it wasn't done very carefully, it gave an opportunity for the older doctors to dismiss it, which they did. And as a result, thousands of women continued to die until enough time passed, and fortunately Semmelweis's insights weren't lost, and someone younger after a while decided that maybe he was right, and eventually the world came around to his opinion that puerperal fever was not born from outside, but rather from bacteria inside. So it raises, a really troubling and fascinating story about the entire scientific enterprise, not just the social sciences, which we agree have their own unique problems. But in the physical sciences even, it's very difficult for truth to out. Data matters. Empirical evidence does matter. But my memory of Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions is that major paradigm shifts often occur through the death of the proponents of the old regime who eventually die out and can't impose their incorrect views on the next generation, and the next generation springs up through this cultural phenomenon that we're talking about. They overcome it only because the old guard dies. So what do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that relates to that lock-in problem. I'm quite sure that books have been written about the Keynesian revolution and about how it was a phenomenon of the new generation. It wasn't so much that the old guard had
convinced,
changed their mind. And I'm quite sure you can say the same thing about the decline of classical liberalism. It wasn't as though, the Herbert Spencers and Aubrey Herberts and William Graham Sumners changed their mind about politics. It was that the de Young took up, social democratic worldviews. So I think certainly there's a lot of truth to that. Your story is fascinating. I hadn't heard that story. It's I guess an example of iatrogenic malady. That is, I think that's a term, iatrogenic. That it's a malady actually from the treatment, from the doctor, which is an important concept because we think of social scientists and economists as sort of policy doctors, but really these doctors are often breeding iatrogenic malady.